Welcome, everybody, to Orange Audubon's special keynote presentation for our North Shore Birding Festival. And we're very honored to have Joan Morrison, Dr. Joan Morrison, here with us. Joan has studied birds of prey in Florida and Chile, focusing on birds living in human-impacted landscapes. And she's an emeritus professor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and earlier worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska, Colorado, Washington, and New Mexico. Dr. Morrison's ongoing research includes monitoring a population of Crested Caracaras in Florida. She and her student, James Dwyer, wrote the chapter on the Crested Caracara and the Birds of North America, published by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Dr. Morrison is strongly committed to conservation and environmental education, and she coordinates regular bird banding programs with students at local middle and elementary schools. Okay, welcome, Joan. There you are, and we have this recorded, so at the very end then we'll take your questions, and everybody, you can put your questions in the chat. Okay, Joan, should we go hit it? All right.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here this evening. Hope you're enjoying the festival so far, and I'm glad that you're here to be with me while I talk about my favorite bird, northern crested caracara, that I've been studying in Florida for almost 30 years now. So how could anything that looks like this be a Florida native? I've had some people say, no, it can't possibly be, but in fact it is, and it's been here since probably the Pleistocene, maybe even before. So let's get some taxonomy out of the way first, because this is very confusing. And of course, bird taxonomy is very confusing still right now, because a lot of the DNA work and the decisions about where birds fit in the tree of relatedness is still ongoing. So in the family falcons, the Falconidae family, the Caracaras are part of that family still. And there are two subfamilies. The first subfamily, Falconidae, contains a lot of species we're familiar with: the peregrine falcon, the kestrel, has many genera in that subfamily: laughing falcon, barred forest falcon, and others. Caracaras are in their own subfamily, Caracarinae, and currently there are 10 species. 2 species of Caracara, northern and southern crested caracara, 4 species of Falcobuenus. This individual here is the striated caracara from the Falkland Islands. Daphrius is the black caracara, the red-throated caracara, Ibicter, and then 2 species in the genus Milvago. This is the Chimango caracara that I studied in Chile. So currently this subfamily only of caracaras, most of which live in South and Central America, are currently still in the falcon family. So let's talk about where I've studied these birds in Florida. And for tonight's talk, I'm going to talk first about habitat associations, where we can find the birds, the status of the population in Florida. Then we'll go over some general biology and ecology, life history, and finally relationship with people, because these birds are a lot like crows and ravens. They're very smart, and they're often associated with a lot of human activities. So the current range of the crested caracara in Florida, the northern crested caracara, if you click on the Birds of the World account in Cornell's website, Birds of the World, this is the range map that you'll see. This is our small isolated Florida population here. Probably some expansion of the population in Texas, and also some in Arizona, which may also be expanding. I've recently started a little bit of work on caracaras in Arizona, so hopefully we'll learn more about that. This map here, the current range developed by my PhD student in 2010 in his dissertation work. The green area represents what he felt to be the current range at that time. All the different little dots are individual nests that we found over the years. Lake Apopka is way up here. Probably can't even see it behind this arrow here. And we know that from eBird and other sightings that the birds are now more and more often seen farther north into Orange County. Maybe some of you have already seen caracaras up in that area. So historically, or prehistorically, what do we know about the species in Florida? Nothing. Nobody has actually studied this bird until I started my studies in the early 90s. And the caracaras really haven't been studied anywhere else in their range except here in Florida. I did have a colleague in Mexico in La Paz area that studied them for a little while. Other than that, we really don't know much about the species throughout its range. But prehistorically in Florida, we could assume that this bird was associated with the two large areas of prairie. This is a map that shows probably some historic vegetation communities and two large prairies here, the Kissimmee Prairie and the DeSoto Prairie. And since we know that caracaras kind of occur still in this area now, we assume that those prairies were where they occurred in the past. The red line, again, sort of represents generally the species range in Florida. And this prairie habitat is characterized by large open expanses of grasslands, few and scattered trees, palm trees, occasionally some oaks, but mostly open, mostly grasslands scattered. And this habitat was probably maintained historically by fire and by grazing animals. Of course, not cows, probably some bison or camel-like species, mega herbivores that occurred back in the Pleistocene that were grazers in this particular habitat. These days, caracaras are found mostly in areas of pasture, improved pastures where the native grasses have been replaced by imported grasses for improved forage for the cattle. But caracaras are almost always found in these improved pastures. They really like cows. There's a picture of Archibald's Buck Island Ranch where you can often find quite a few caracaras in the pastures there. And one of the things we discovered while we were doing our research, we had a lot of radio tag birds, that when we found the radio tag birds, they were almost always located in pastures that had cows in them. So caracaras really do like the presence of cows. We can talk about why a little bit later. This particular graph shows what I call Florida succession and has to do a lot with how and why the population is classified as threatened by both the federal government and by the state. And it's primarily due to loss of habitat. So Florida succession starts with the native habitat, the prairie habitat, that at some point is converted into pasture, again, the improved pasture with different grasses and different management regimes. But a lot of that pasture is currently being converted into other things, citrus, other agriculture, and of course, from the worst perspective for caracaras, into urban development, cities, housing, and maybe even Disney World. As you can see, this is a one-way trip. The habitat never goes back. And so part of the reason the Florida population of caracaras is listed is because the habitat is going away. So caracaras like history in Florida. When I started out focusing on the birds' breeding biology, we wanted to know where their nests were. Currently, they nest mostly in cabbage palms. This is where we found most of their nests, which is interesting because cabbage palms don't support their nests very well. Caracaras are the only falcon that actually builds a real nest. Most of them, like the peregrines, use scrapes in cliffs or on rocks. Kestrels nest in boxes. But caracaras actually build a rather large, kind of flimsy nest made mostly out of twigs and small, thin vines, you can see here. And sometimes these nests get so big, they actually fall out of the trees. And so we could find, but they're easy to see. And when we would approach the cabbage palms, we could usually easily find the nest if we knew what we were looking for. And when we started, we didn't know what we were looking for. And just looking at this picture, you'd never know that there was a caracara nest in this central palm tree. And the only reason we found it was because we watched a bird fly into the tree with food. We knew the nest and the chicks were in there. And so over the years, we learned that if we watched the behavior of the birds and monitored where they were going and watched them carrying sticks and food, that we could find the nest that way. And once we found the nest, then we had to get data because caracaras nesting in these cabbage palms, the nests are hard to access. You can't safely climb a palm tree. You can't get up around the fronds to look in the nest. So we had to come up with some other ways to find what we needed to know. And so we got real creative. This is a long extendable pole being held by my assistant here, and it has a fisheye mirror on the end of it. And I'm trying not to sit in any cow piles while I'm looking through the binoculars to try to see what's in the nest. And we could see into the nest and count the number of eggs and the number of chicks. And when the chicks got bigger, we elicited the help of a friend who had a tree surgeon. He had a big bucket truck, and he would come out with us and help us get into the nest so we could safely take the chicks out and band them and put on radio tags. And this is what we found. Here are a couple of little chicks about 2 weeks old. At this age, they're pretty cute, but they have really bad hair. As you can see, their first down plumage is yellow with some little brown spots on their wings, on their butts, and their little bad brown hair. By 4 weeks or 5 weeks, they're in what I call the blob stage. They just kind of lay around and eat and are pretty fat, but you can see the pin feathers starting to come out here, this age. And they stay in the nest as chicks for about 8 weeks. Incubation is about 4 weeks, and the nestling period is about 8 weeks long. And when they fledge, you can really tell a recent fledgling by its plumage. You can see here the white tips on the edges of the coverts and the long vertical streaks on the chest, the very pale face and leg skin, and just the posture. They look like kind of goofy teenagers. Their posture is very recognizable. Their plumage is very recognizable. And then they do some silly behaviors. Often you can see them lying on the ground playing with cow pies, flipping cow pies as this one is doing. Or sometimes they'll play with each other or even playing with vultures. We watched a lot of that kind of goofy behavior as they're trying to figure out how to navigate the world. I'm going to show you just a few graphs because I want to give you some information about what we learned about the population. As I said, when I started, nobody really knew anything about this population or about the species. So we wanted to try to figure out what its breeding cycle looked like. And when I started, I thought that this bird would have a pretty narrow breeding season like most raptors and breed and be done with it. And that turned out not to be true. It turned out that caracaras in Florida can start breeding as early as September, October. We're in the middle of the season right now. The peak of egg laying is usually about January. You can see in these distributions for the 5 years, the peak of egg laying, which is the green bars, is almost always January. And then I decided to look at rainfall as a possible factor affecting when the birds were breeding, because the pattern's pretty distinct. And if you remember, in Florida, the summers are pretty wet. There's a lot of rainfall, the pastures get wet, the wetlands fill up. There's a lot of breeding by the frogs and the salamanders and the amphibians and the fish and everything living in these wetlands. But if you look at about October, all these red arrows point to a drastic downfall in the average monthly rainfall. Each year in October, there's a pretty good, really rapid and significant drop down in the amount of rainfall. And right after that drop down is when the caracaras kick in their breeding season. And I think possibly the reason this happens is because when that drawdown occurs, all those wetlands that are full of frogs and fish and salamanders and other foods start to dry up, and they become concentrated, the food becomes concentrated, and the caracaras can easily wade around the edges of these little wetlands and feed on these organisms that are our favorite foods for the caracaras. So this is just a hypothesis, but it was a pretty clear pattern that emerged that right after that drawdown in the fall, the caracaras begin breeding. So another idea we started with our research was that if a species is listed as threatened or endangered, they often have demographic problems. In other words, they have trouble breeding. They can't find a mate, they can't breed successfully, they can't lay eggs successfully. Something's wrong with their population production and they're not producing young. So we started out looking at that and following these pairs in their territories and learning that pairs on their territories stay there all year. Caracaras in Florida don't migrate. They're resident, they stay there all year. And when they stay on their territories all the time, every year they pretty much produce a nesting attempt. So almost all the birds that were on territory every year had a breeding attempt. Those breeding attempts went across quite a long period of time, as I showed you earlier. But there's a lot of variation across the Florida range. But they could breed anywhere from September, October into April and May, long season. Fletch size didn't differ from historical egg records, so they weren't having any trouble laying eggs. Nest success was pretty high, similar to other raptors, so they were producing them. And the productivity was clearly at or above replacement. So they were cranking out young pretty well and having then obviously no problem reproducing. But the other thing we learned that was really interesting was that pairs can make more than one nesting attempt in the same season. And this really surprised me because raptors usually don't do that. Their seasons are fairly long and their young develop slowly. And I thought it wasn't possible that caracaras would be doing this, but it turns out that they were. And so this graph shows, again, the distribution of nesting attempts over the season, September through May or so, the green bars. And the orange bars represent the percent of the nests started in any particular month that were reinitiated again. So these pairs that were nesting in October, for example, 100% of those pairs would go on to make another nest at some later time, perhaps February or March, maybe even into April. And it turns out that pairs can re-nest after a failure. Some of these early pairs, sometimes they lose their early nest to a snowstorm or to predation. And so those pairs can actually re-nest and bring on a successful nest later on. Or if they have a successful nest at first, these early pairs in October or November, they can go on and have a second successful brood later on in the spring. So this was a surprise and something that was really interesting to learn about this population, that they are capable of making two nests in one breeding season. And it turns out that evolutionarily, the reason that this such strategy persists in these birds is that pairs that make two nests in a year successfully raise more chicks than pairs that only made one nest in a year. And that this graph shows that on average, the pairs that double brooded had more young than single brooded pairs. And that means that the double brooded pairs potentially can provide more young into the breeding population. And so that's why this strategy persists in this caracara population. So when fledglings come out of their nest and start to navigate the world, they can run into all kinds of interesting situations. They often get harassed by other birds because they do prey on other birds' nests. They eat eggs and nestlings. And of course, as scavengers, they have to be very wary of dead things lying on the ground. Scavengers have to be wary of an animal that looks dead because it might in fact not be dead and it might jump up and eat them. So they're very wary when they approach something that appears to be carrion. And sometimes they'll wait around until another caracara shows up, or maybe vultures, to start feeding on the carcass to indicate that in fact it is a safe food item. So we did some diet studies. I had a lot of students who were really eager to tear apart pellets and prey remains that we collected at the bottom of nests over all the years. And what these percentages represent are the percentages of the sample that we found these organisms in. So in the pellets and prey remains, we found 49% of those samples contained bits of mammals. A lot of them contain fish and reptiles, also birds and amphibians, and 100% of the pellets that we examined contained insects. So these birds are eating a lot of insects. They're walking around on the pastures, flipping cow pies, eating worms and beetles and other insects, arthropods. But some of the results were surprising. Fish bones, for example. Where are they getting fish? Well, again, when those wetlands dry up in the fall and fish in there, the green catfish and minnows and other small fish are available, they can make use of those resources. And so investigating the carrion meant looking at the larger bones that we found in the prey remains, things that were too large for the caracaras to kill, raccoons, otters, armadillos, things like that, rabbits, and assumed that those bones represented carrion. And it turns out that in their diet, perhaps only about a third of their diet is carrion. And if you think about it, carrion is an ephemeral resource. Can't predict when it's going to show up. It only shows up once in a while. And so food items like in their reproduction. But carrion is currently pretty important, especially along the roads in Florida where you see a lot of it. And this is what we found when we go out looking for prey remains and diet items. You can see bits of armadillo here, perhaps the vertebra of the snake, and rabbit bones, these little shells of the mud turtles. They really love the mud turtles. And of course, different pellets from different nests that we found. Another interesting item that we found when doing our diet studies is that when caracaras eat a lot of beetles, which they get at carrion or just from the pastures, walking around in the pastures, it turns out a lot of these beetles are kind of toxic. They have a lot of toxic substances in their bodies. Here's an example of a beetle, genus Necrodes, that has these little red markings on their back, which indicate toxicity. You might remember a lot of species in the wild have red or have markings that would indicate that they're toxic. And caracaras are eating a lot of these toxic beetles. And we published a paper on this with a chemical ecologist who helped us to determine what those chemicals were. And we think that it's quite interesting that the caracaras can eat so many of these beetles without being sick. And we're wondering how they can do that successfully. But of course, carrion is always a really yummy food source, especially when it's fresh. They love armadillos and rabbits. That's probably the favorite, but they will take anything they can get. So another thing that we learned that was interesting when I was doing my breeding biology studies, I would often see large groups of caracaras around the range when I was traveling, and sometimes as many as 50 or 60 birds together, all different ages. You can see in this picture some adults, some young birds, some fledglings. They would be hanging out together, foraging in different places, and wondering how to study this. What does this mean? Why are they hanging around in these groups? Why aren't they on territories? So in 2010, I had a PhD student, James Dwyer, who took subsequent photos coming up, who focused his study on this idea of understanding why caracaras form groups. And in his studies, he put out a lot of carcasses and watched the birds come, tagged a lot of birds to understand where they came from and where they went. He recorded behaviors, he watched their feeding behaviors, he watched their interactions. You can see on the far right, perhaps, a bird with a very yellow crop. When they get older, that little crop in the front of their chest gets yellow, which I think is some kind of a social signal, perhaps indicating, I'm a really good provider, look at my big full crop. But he recorded a lot of what was going on at these carcasses. A lot of interesting behaviors. This is the head throwback behavior that some of you may have seen, where they throw their head way back and make a rattling sound. Maybe it's an aggressive behavior or territorial behavior. A lot of fighting, a lot of chasing. Even among the different age groups, he tried to record who was dominant over who. But also he learned in following all these non-breeders, because all of these birds and groups were apparently not associated with any territory, that they would travel around amongst the state among these different communal roosts. They're represented here by these yellow circles. All the little blue dots are just individual bird locations, but the communal roosts are quite spread throughout the Caracaras range. And he found that the birds would travel between these communal roosts over time, and traveling sort of throughout the range, but stopping here and there at these different roosts. So what was going on? And he tracked them throughout the year and discovered that non-breeders, during the non-breeding season, basically the summertime, they wouldn't move a lot. They had these little small home ranges. These red areas are representing 8 or 9 different birds that through the non-breeding season didn't go very far. But during the breeding season, these same birds now are traveling all over the place. These blue areas are representing the same birds, but how they moved throughout the breeding season. And he wondered why that was the case. And the idea, and again, we published this recently, that during the breeding season, these birds are moving more widely because they're prospecting. They're looking for openings in territories. If there's not a lot of habitat out there, they have to sort of fight for the openings when they can get a chance to move into a territory where maybe a mate has died, or try to find a new territory where they could set up a nest. So that was really interesting, that he discovered that the birds were really moving around a lot during the breeding season. So part of my earlier work started, again, with understanding the breeding biology, understanding the home range and habitat use of the birds in the pasture habitats. Of course, I had to learn how to catch them if I was going to radio tag them. That's another long story. But we started out with VHF telemetry, which meant antennas and flying in small airplanes and not getting very many points. But these days, we can use these really nifty, smaller solar-powered GPS telemetry units that talk to the cell network. And that means I can sit in my office and look at my computer and download all the locations. We get hundreds of locations a month now with these transmitters. And here's an example of a Google Earth shot of one bird over 1 month. You can see all the different locations that give you a really nice idea of this bird's home range, even over a very short period of time. This is probably the nest site over here, where there's lots of locations. This may be a favorite roost or a favorite foraging place, but we get much, much more data using these new GSM units. It's really a nice progression of the technology that's allowed us to get much better data. And so the question currently that I'm working on is understanding what happens to nesting pairs when their habitat gets changed, when their nest tree is taken down or there's conversion of their foraging habitat. We want to know, do those birds move and find another territory? Do they just sort of disperse and never reproduce again? Do they just die? We're trying to understand what happens to them when their habitat disappears. But when I first started and we're learning about the home range, again, we were trying to understand what habitats the birds were using and what habitats they seem to prefer. And again, the pasture habitats with cattle, with the scattered trees, the open grassland was really what Caracaras like. And here's an aerial view of ideal Caracara real estate, real open habitat with scattered potential nest trees, a nice wetland there in the middle where they can find a lot of food. And over the years, we've learned that their habitat in their home range averages around 3,000 acres. That's just the average, but that's what the management agencies are currently using for their management guidelines, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state. Caracaras, when they put zones around nest trees for protection, things like that, we use the 3,000 acre figure. One other thing we learned when we were tagging the young birds, we tagged a lot of young chicks in the nest or shortly after they left the nest to try to understand where they went after they left their natal territory and left their home range. And we measure something called natal dispersal, which is the distance between where the bird hatched and where it ended up at the place where it made its first breeding attempt, found the mate, found the territory, and actually made a nest. And it turned out that females moved a whole lot farther than males. This is a pretty small sample. We have a much better sample now. But females, in general, move a lot farther away from where they hatch than males do. And this is pretty typical for most birds. So not a surprise. We had some female caracaras that nested as much as 40 kilometers away from where they were hatched. So that was another interesting thing we figured out. So what's the current status of the population? Well, again, it's still listed as threatened, both federally and by the state. And since the population is isolated, that means there are no other birds coming in from other places. There are no birds leaving, as far as we know. I've banded and tagged over 200 or 300 caracaras over the years, and there's never been a band return or a sighting of any of my birds outside of Florida. So the population is isolated, and currently I like to suggest that it represents something I call the fishbowl syndrome, which means the population is like a fishbowl that has a whole bunch of fish in it, or birds in this case, and the birds are reproducing quite well, which means they're putting more and more birds into that fishbowl, and the fishbowl is forever shrinking because the habitat is going away. And so sooner or later, you end up with a situation where the fishbowl is so small that the birds can't breed anymore, or population can't persist anymore. And I think that's sort of where we are with the Florida caracara population at this point. So the challenge for population persistence is figuring out how to maintain sufficient habitat so that the birds can find nesting territories and breed successfully, but also so those groups of non-breeders can survive and find communal roosts and find enough food to last until they themselves can find a breeding opportunity. And of course, over the years, I worked a lot with people. This is a very people-oriented project because the caracaras do live on the cattle ranches. We worked a lot with the landowners. Many landowners were very gracious in letting us work on their ranches. We worked closely with them, and they came out and worked with us and saw the birds, and we talked to them about what we were doing. We published a lot of literature. Cattlemen's Association, University of Florida, where I did my graduate work, we published a lot of public type documents there, just to try to reach people, to help them understand the birds and what the birds were doing and what they needed. These days, you can find more and more caracaras in people places, nesting in strange places like on the back of billboards, cell towers. We see caracaras often in citrus groves. They seem to like to forage for bugs in those groves and possibly even hang out under the trees, particularly in the summer when it's really hot, because it might be cooler under the trees during that season. But we're still really trying to educate people and work with people and really make it a broad, people-oriented project. But of course, we like to see the crazy behaviors that these birds do. These pictures were taken by my friend in Texas, Patty Rainey, who has caracaras coming around where she lives pretty regularly, and she gets these wonderful photos of silly things like fledglings looking silly, looking like little teenagers, just gawking at something down there at the bottom of that fence post. Or birds taking a bath. The bird on the far right here, you may be able to see, is exhibiting the begging posture. It's probably begging for some food from its parent, who is busy taking a dust bath. Caracaras do like to bathe. They like to bathe pretty regularly, but they don't like to be watched when they're bathing. And this lower left photo is showing a behavior called halopreening. Caracara pairs, the adult pairs, are very faithful to each other, and they often preen each other, which is called halopreening. But sometimes caracaras and vultures will preen each other as well. Again, that's still called allopreening, but it's among different species. And over the years, I've worked with a lot of organizations. They've been generous at funding my work. I started with the Avon Park Air Force Range. They had some birds on their property that we started working with. But I've also been funded and worked closely with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Back in those days, it was called the Game and Fish Commission. The Water Management Districts, the Florida Cattlemen's Association, University of Florida, where I did my graduate work, And over all the years, I've been based at Archbold Biological Station's Buck Island Ranch. So they've been very generous in their support. And of course, on the ranch, there are lots and lots of caracaras. So that's been a really good situation over time. So thank you very much for being.
Okay. Let's see. Joan, can you be heard?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. And we're getting a question from Paul Eisenbrown, and I forgot to mention that it was Paul's finding one of Joan's students' banded birds that led us to making the connection for this wonderful talk. So Paul has the question: how do you capture a full-size bird to band it?
Well, like I said earlier, that's kind of a long story. I'll get into it in a minute, but I first want to say that I really appreciate any photos or information that anybody can send about a banded bird that they see. There are a lot of them out there, and that information is valuable to us in terms of understanding survival of the birds and also where they move. We've had some birds, like I mentioned, I think earlier, that the longevity record now is about 27 years of a bird in captivity, bird in the wild, that we banded, that we knew when it was banded, and someone got a photo of it recently. So we know that is at least 27, which is pretty cool. In terms of capturing, I use what's called a bow net. It's just a large net kind of on a spring mechanism that you can put bait inside that net, or you can we have a dummy stuffed caracara that we put in there, and we usually set it up near a nest because the birds are so territorial. They don't like seeing another bird or what they think is another bird, a dummy, or sometimes even just food, because they're so interested in feeding their chicks that they'll walk into the big bow net. It's pretty big. And they walk in, and we spring the bow net and catch them that way. But it took me about 9 months to figure that out when I first started. So it was quite an effort that took a long time. But it works now really well. So we've caught a lot of adult birds and banded them that way. Okay. I see somebody calls them the toupee bird. Yep, they do have very interesting toupees.
Okay, I didn't want to ask that one next. Myra says that, let's see, is there a hierarchy for carrion feeding with vultures?
There is sort of, but it tends to vary a lot. James Dwyer looked at this question when he did his dissertation, and I think he actually found that the young birds sometimes would beat up on the older birds in their access to carrion, and maybe even beat up on the vultures. Other times, vultures will be dominant. It sort of depends on how many individuals of different species are there. If a lot of black vultures show up, everybody else leaves. I mean, black vultures are pretty aggressive, and they'll sort of scare off everybody. But sometimes the young caracaras are pretty bold. I actually watched one haul off and punch a vulture in the face one time with his foot. I also saw a young bird jump on the tail of a vulture one time to try to distract it away from carrion. So there's all kinds of things that go on with those behaviors. And I think the hierarchy varies depending on probably the size of the carrion and who's there.
Okay, another one. Are bugs the reason they like to be by cows?
I think partly bugs, but I think partly the presence of cows in those places raises the productivity of those places generally. This is a hypothesis that I've had for a long time that I really wish a graduate student would take on. The cattle are putting nutrients into that environment all the time with their poop and their pee, and they're fed extra molasses and things in the winter. The grasses are very good for forage, and so there's a lot of primary productivity in those places, which is where all the food chain starts. And when you have a lot of energy at those basic levels, it supports everything else. So there's lots and lots of things in those pastures. There's snakes and frogs in the wetlands, and salamanders and amphibians in the wetlands, and bugs everywhere and worms everywhere. So I think there's just a whole lot of energy and nutrients in those pasture areas, and a lot of it's provided by the cows. And so it results in a lot of availability of food resources for them there.
At the Center for Birds of Prey, the volunteers dread going into the Caracara cage. Have you ever been hurt?
Yeah, actually, like I said, these birds are really smart. They remember things. They remember people. The ones up there at Maitland, they had a caracara there named Leshler for a while that hated blonde people, blonde women particularly, so he did not like me very well. They do take offense to certain people for whatever reason. We had a captive bird with us for a while where we were testing radios and things like that, and he really did not like my assistant, Steve. And I had him on the glove one day next to me, and he reached over and bit me right on the bottom of my ear, that place where it really hurt. So yeah, they can be pretty temperamental, and they can remember. We also had them chase our vehicles. They remembered vehicles as we drove down the road, even if we weren't going to stop at their nests. They would chase us sometimes. So yeah, they're pretty fun to work with because they're pretty smart.
Okay. And Lara says, is there any impact on the caracaras because the native grasses were replaced with non-native ones on ranches?
It's hard to say because we really don't have historical information. One of the reasons I think maybe they aren't in the prairies as much as in the pastures is the grasses are pretty short. They're grazed, they're burned, they're turned over and disked and plowed for sometimes. And so the caracaras spend a lot of their time walking around, eating bugs and things like that. And so they can see really well. They can see predators, they can see approaching competitors in that open environment. In the prairies, like up at Kissimmee Prairie Reserve and some other of those prairies, the grasses are a lot taller and they could hide predators like bobcats or coyotes. There actually tend not to be as many nests in those prairies as there are in the pastures. And so it's hard to say from a food standpoint whether that replacement would make a difference. But I think just the management regimes in the different areas, the prairies are managed more for natural prairie species like grasshopper sparrows and things like that. So I think those management differences make a difference more than the actual plants. I had another question. I can see, where can I send a picture with banded caracaras? I need to get my email out there so people can send me pictures or information. So can we somehow send out my email address for people to do that?
Yeah, and we'll put it at the end of this program.
Okay, great, thanks.
You can see the questions, Joan?
I can.
Go ahead.
Let me address that one about ranchers and cows. Raptors typically don't go after something bigger than themselves because those animals would hurt them. An eagle is not going to go after a wolf because a wolf could kill an eagle. They go after prey items that are smaller than themselves. I know that ranchers often think that caracaras kill calves. I have yet to see any proof of that. I know that in South America, they do kill lambs. Lambs are really small. They're much smaller than calves. And there is proof that that happens in South America, that can be a problem. The caracaras there actually are a little larger and they do kill lambs sometimes. But in terms of killing calves, a caracara is much smaller than a calf and it would never go after a live calf to kill it. My suspicion is that the calves are already born dead and the person may see the caracara on the calf after it's dead and think the caracara killed it without really knowing whether that's true or not. Or the calf may be sick or deformed or ill or something's wrong with it and it can't get up right away, or maybe the female has had a problem with the birth, can't get up right away, can't defend the calf. And then maybe caracaras and vultures will swoop in and dispatch a wounded animal or a sick animal or a less than healthy, vigorous animal. That's possible. But again, I know this is something that's come up many times. It's come up even in Texas, and we're all still waiting for some actual proof, some photography or other information that really provides solid evidence that this in fact occurs. So that's just where I'm at on that one.
Okay.
Thanks for the great questions. Yeah, I know that sometimes ranchers kill caracaras. That's actually a problem because they're listed. So I hope that that doesn't happen. I would rather them talk to someone in wildlife services or talk to someone in Game and Fish or talk to me before they actually just go out and start killing things, because that actually is illegal as the birds are listed. But that's all I can really say about that.
And she says that was in Endangered County about the calves.
Yeah, well, I hope I can talk to ranchers about those kinds of things, because we do have the conversation and usually it goes pretty well because we try to understand each other. Yeah, education is a big part of it. That's partly why we printed all of our materials over the years and hope to keep doing that and hope to keep talking to ranchers as we continue the work, because that's where the education happens and people can get good information. And I can get information too. They have a lot of information for me. And like I said, the ranches is where these birds live. And it's been really great working with so many of them over the years that have really proven that cattle ranches in Florida are ideal places for wildlife. They have lots and lots of native species on them. They're great places to see a lot of wildlife. And if you want to do that sort of in a tourist capacity, Buck Island Ranch has regular tours that you can take a buggy ride around the ranch and see all kinds of things there. And they have lots and lots of caracaras. So that I will guarantee that you'll see one there. How healthy is the population? Like I mentioned, they're doing just fine so far. They're cranking out young. They eat everything, so it's not like they're short for food. They seem to be doing pretty well. Their problem is really habitat. The habitat is disappearing and being compromised, being converted into habitats that they cannot use. And so this is the big problem with the population in Florida. Otherwise, as birds, they're doing pretty well.
Okay. Any other questions? We are in the festival. A lot of people have early trips.
Field trips, yeah.
But this is a great opportunity. All right, I'm going to write her email here. Caracara3. Oh, somebody else is talking about the crops. Can you see that?
Yeah, the crops. Crops are usually associated with scavenging birds. If anybody's ever seen a picture of a marabou stork, the crop looks like this gigantous thing hanging down the front of their neck. It's actually quite unsightly, but the crops are there because birds that feed on ephemeral resources like carrion, they can't always be guaranteed of the carrion being there. So when they get a chance to eat, they want to really gorge. And so they gorge on the food, they gorge on the carrion, and the crop sticks out. Now, most other raptors do have a crop. They just don't fill it up and let it stick out that way quite so much as the caracaras do. They may find a prey item and they eat the whole thing and it disappears right away. It doesn't sit around in the crop for a long period of time. But that's how birds pretty much digest their food, is it sort of sits in this crop area for a little while and digests out of there slowly, particularly for the carrion eaters. So that's why you don't see it on other raptors, but on the caracaras, it's pretty visible. And being bright yellow like that, I think it's what would be considered a social signal. Other birds can see that yellow, and if the adult bird has a bright sticking out yellow crop, then maybe its mate thinks, oh, this is a good bird to mate with. And look how much food it has. Its crop is really big and I can see it, and therefore it might be a good mate. That's usually what social signals mean.
Anything else? All right, I'll put up her email. Just a second.
Yes, and I appreciate anything people want to send me, or link or connections or links. I'm always happy to provide information, and I love getting the data because it helps us over the long term. Now we've been doing it for so many years that we can learn about survival and longevity and movements and all those kinds of things. So thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you so much. Oh, one more question. Do they lose facial color depending on different behaviors?
Facial color. The facial color, the skin is typically yellow or orange as they get older, and the depth of the color, the redness, is controlled by blood flow. When there's a lot of blood in the face, then it gets much redder or deeper orange. That is probably controlled facultatively by behaviors. Some people think that when they're scared or in a fight or in an aggressive situation that the blood drains and the colors get paler. Sometimes it's the other way around. It's hard to say what causes that change. James Dwyer published a paper on that particular question. I don't recall it off the top of my head, but maybe I can provide you, Deborah, with the reference, and people can take a look if they want. But he looked a little bit about the kinds of changes that he saw when he was doing his behavioral work in those color changes, and tried to understand why they were changing like that. So I'll provide that reference when people would like to see it.
Okay, that's great. And I might as well say that we are in the festival, orangeaudubonfl.org/festival. And there are still a very limited number of slots left, but we are still accepting new registrants if you want to check it out. And well, it's exciting. We're off to, with this talk, we're off to a very great start. So there's Joan's email. And we'll thank you again, Joan.
Thank you. Have a good time on your field trips.
Okay.
Hope you see one.
We'll let you know.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody.